You've seen one way to set properties already. We can set properties in the XAML directly, or we can modify them in the properties window, as we did with the name property for the elements we were working with. It's often easiest to set them in the markup. And as you saw, when you do set them in the markup, let the designer create the quote marks for you. That is, type the name of the attribute. You can select it from the IntelliSense if you like. Press Tab, and the designer will insert equals and quotes. The quotes have to be there, so don't fight the designer, just let them do it. I've learned just to take my hands off the keyboard after I press Tab, and then start again by entering the property value. But some complex properties are simply easier to set in the properties window. For example, we're going to create a gradient fill, and there's a lot of markup involved in creating a gradient fill. It's just easier to allow the designer to do that for us. Let's step back and look at modifying our application to add some properties where the properties window makes things easier. For the sake of this demonstration, imagine that you want to ensure that the height of the button control is always the same as the height of the text box. Well, of course, because of the way we've laid this out, that's guaranteed to be the case. But just go with me here because I'm going to show you how to set up a binding between two properties using the properties window. Now, even setting up a binding is very simple in markup directly, but it's even easier using the properties window. We haven't really talked about binding at all in this course, really, but it allows you to connect a property of one object and a property of another object so they stay in sync with each other. So if I wanted to ensure that the height of this button was always the same as the height of the text box, which I repeat, it always will be because of the way we've laid it out right now. They're both set to stretch, and the height, actually they're not both set to stretch, but in any case they both will fill the space they're in. In any case, let's do it using a binding just to prove the point. Over here in the properties window, I need to find the height property for the button, and that's not always easy. So one quick and easy way to do it is to find the search text box and enter the name of the property you'd like to modify, here. Now, in the current build of Visual Studio that I'm using, there's a slight, I would call this a bug, because we cannot see right now the little glyph we would need to see to create the binding. If you don't see it, make the properties window a little wider, and then you will see this little box over here on the right-hand side, which allows you to modify properties of the property. So let me click the little box, and that brings up a context menu, which allows me to, among other things, create a data binding. Remember, if you don't see that little box next to the property, make the properties window wider. I'll create a data binding, and I can choose what I want to bind to. There are lots of options here, and we're not going to dig into binding in this exploratory course, but I will specify an element name. I want to bind to the URL text box, and I want to bind to the height property of the URL text box. I can also specify down here whether I want a one-way binding, a one-time binding, which means it happens only when the window is first loaded, or a two-way binding. So if I change the height of the button, for example, it will also change the height of the text box. One way is fine with me, so our button always just retrieves its height from the text box. And clicking OK adds the markup we need to set the height to be the same as the height of the text box. If you've never seen a binding expression, it appears within curly braces, and this specifies that we're going to bind the height property of this button to the height property of URL text box. And the properties window just took care of that for us. Now I don't really need or want this binding, so I'm going to undo that change. Let's try another feature that the properties window helps with. Imagine that I want the background of the text box to be a gradient fill. Let's find the text box and then go set up that fill. Now again, I've right now filtered for the height property, so that's not what I want. Let me clear the search. What I want instead is a brush, the background brush actually, and I can modify this. Now, one thing I can do, and we'll talk more about this later, is choose a system resource. And here's a bunch of brushes you can use that can apply to this text box. But I don't want to choose a system resource. We'll look at that later. What I want to do is come here and create a gradient brush. I'll choose gradient brush, and you can see it's a vertical gradient going from black to white by default. If I choose this color, I can instead choose, say, an orangish color. I'm artistically challenged, so I'm sure this will be hideous no matter what I select. Over here, I will select, say, blue. And now we have a gradient going, oh, that's just too ugly. I can't live with it. I'll choose yellow instead. Oh, that's way better. And now you can see that I've used the properties window to create this gradient. And if I come look in the markup, we'll see that that inserted a linear gradient brush element defining all the colors and the endpoints and the start point and the colors and the offsets. It's all there. It saved me from typing all that information. So although it's often easier just to create simple properties here in the markup, you'll find for complex properties, you'll probably want to use the properties window instead. So far, nothing happens in our application when you click the Go button. That's because we've never hooked up any events. Each control provides events that enable you to respond to user actions. They do a lot more as well. They can respond to system actions or timers or just something happening. For example, changing the orientation of your screen. A button provides a click event, which is raised when the button is clicked. We can create an event handler to handle that event, and we need to register the event handler with the control so it knows that the code is there. There are several ways to create event handlers, as you'll see. We can create them declaratively. That is, we set the control's event attribute with the name of the event handler function, or we can do it programmatically. In code, we can retrieve a reference to the control and add an event handler reference to that control reference. In our demonstration, we'll try both. Let's start by adding a click event handler for this button. A simple way to do that is to go to the Properties window, click the Event Handlers button, find the correct event here, and enter the name that you'd like to assign to the event handling procedure. I'll call mine Handle Click, although a standard convention is to call it Go button underscore click. Either one works fine, and once you choose a name, press Enter to take you directly to that event handling procedure. That's one way to do it. Let's remove the code, go back to our markup, and notice that it did specify here a click attribute should call the Go button underscore click procedure, which doesn't exist anymore. Let me show a different way to do that. I could also search for the click attribute here, type equals, and then we get a little tip which suggests a new event handler. I click that, and it creates an event handler, and it names it using the same convention, Go button underscore click, but it appends an underscore 1. And that bothers me somehow. So I tend not to use that technique because I very rarely want to have a procedure named underscore 1. I could change the name if I wanted, but again, it just bugs me. So I often come to the click property here in the properties window and just give it a name myself, which I'm going to call Handle Click, press Enter, and there is our event handler. Notice here's the one that got created for us. We're not going to use it, so I'll remove it. I need to add some code here, and one way for me to get the code is type it. Another is for me to go to a text file that I've created so you don't have to watch me type, which is pretty painful, and I'll copy it and paste it in here. So when we do click that button, we'll call DemoWebView.Navigate. That's a method of the WebView control. It takes a URI as a parameter. So we'll give it a new URI, and we pass to the constructor of that URI the current URL within the URL text box. We get the text property from the text box and use it to navigate in the web view. Now, of course, this doesn't take care of the problem that occurs when the URL text box doesn't have a text value. We'll come back to that in a moment. But this should now at least do something. So let me save it, build it, and run it. And now if I come type something in here like http://www.microsoft.com, click the Go button, by golly, if it doesn't take us to the current incarnation of Microsoft's website. So that does seem to work. It's not a very interesting web browser, but it certainly is the most minimal web browser we could ever hope to create. Let's go back to our code. I'll press Alt F4 to quit the application. Go back to Visual Studio, wait for it to stop running. And let's review that other way of creating an event handler. I'll go back to mainpage.xaml, and let's say we'd like to make it so the Go button is disabled unless there's actually some text in the text box. Now, we could also check to make sure it's a valid URL, but that's a topic for a different day. I'm just going to check to make sure there's something in the text box. To make that happen, we need to first ensure that this button isn't enabled when the application starts. So let's go back to the Properties window and search for the Enabled button. I need to get out of whatever I just started. Here we go. Search for Enabled. And there appears to be an isEnabled property. I need it to be set to false for the button. So by unchecking it, you'll notice that I added here in the markup isEnabled equals false. So the button is disabled when the application first starts. Then, in the text changed event of this text box, I want to enable or disable the button depending on the current value of the text in the text box. So let's come here and do what I showed in the demonstration prior to this, and that is enter the text changed event and let it suggest an event handler name. I'll come here, it calls it URL text box underscore text changed underscore 1, UG. I can right click and choose navigate to event handler, and it will take me right to that event handler, where I can add code to ensure that the Go button is disabled if there's not any text in the text box. Again, I'll go to my little text file, copy that line of code, and paste it in here so you don't have to watch me type it. And that line of code says Go button.isEnabled, it's a Boolean value, we're going to assign a true or false into it, takes on the value of URL textbox.text.length is greater than 0. That's either true or false. So we'll assign a true or false value to isEnabled based on whether the length is greater than 0 or not. Let's save it and run it again. And now, if there's nothing in the text box, the Go button should be disabled. Can't even try to go anywhere. If I enter some text, immediately that button becomes enabled. Or if I delete the text, it becomes disabled again. It's a simple UI feature. It may not even be what you want, but at least it shows off a different way of creating an event handler. Now, to demonstrate a third way of creating an event handler, I'm going to need to modify the UI slightly. And here, although this is completely superfluous, I'm going to add a button that allows us to clear the text in the URL text box. Now, perhaps you didn't notice, but the text box in a Metro app does have a little X on the right-hand side, so it will clear the text for you. But imagine that we wanted to add our own. It's a contrived example. I'm just trying to show off how to do this here. So go with me. I'm going to add a new column to the inner grid. Let me go do that in the markup. And we'll add a column, say, here. Now, of course, I need to modify my text box. Right now, my text box is set with its grid.columnSpan property equal to 2. It spans 2 columns. We added a new column, but we didn't move the text box, so that's what it's going to do. Instead, let's set just grid.column equal to 1, so now it appears in the column numbered 1. Not 0, not 2, but 1, the middle column of the 3 columns that I have. I want to put a new button in this column that says clear, so it clears this text box. Let's add a button here to do that. I can come to my toolbox, add a button. It's a little tricky with the UI because I don't have room here. So instead, I'm going to pin this down so I actually now can see both the design surface and the toolbox. Let me put that button in here. There we are. And let's confirm that the horizontal alignment is set to stretch and the vertical alignment is set to stretch. And we don't want any margin on this button, and its content should be clear. And you know, I really do want a name property for anything I'm going to interact with in code, so I better set the name to be clear button. And we got another small problem is that this button isn't wide enough for its text. So let's come up to our grid.column definitions and make sure the width of this column is set to auto and the width of this column is just set to star. When we created that new column, they put funky values in there, and if I set them this way, it looks better. So we have our clear button, and I want to hook up its event handler. But imagine for a moment that I can't hook up the event handler until the application is running. To do that, I'll need to put some code in this page's constructor. So let's do that. I'll press F7 to view the code, and then in the constructor for this class, let's hook up the code dynamically at runtime. Here, I'll type clear button. Don't see clear button there. If you have this happen, it could be an artifact of this being an early build of Visual Studio, or it may just be the way it's supposed to be. But I'll build my project, and now I'm guessing I will see clear button as one of the values in the IntelliSense. Clear button.click, I'm hooking up the click event handler. I'll add a plus equals, and here you'll see you have the option to press tab to insert. This is not new in this version of Visual Studio. Press tab to insert, and I can press tab again to actually generate that code snippet. So let me go press tab again, and here I have my event handler. The event handler has a throw statement in there to throw an exception if you actually try to use it to remind you, hey, you added this event handler, you never added any code, you better go add the code. So I'll delete that, and instead I'll add code which will set URL textbox.text equal to an empty string. So now we have an explicit button to clear that text box. Let's save it and run it one more time. Of course, the clear button has nothing to do unless there's some text. Say I type something in. Now notice the clear button is completely superfluous because we have this X over here, but imagine you turn that off, or you didn't notice it, and you want the clear button to work, and of course, it does its job. When I click the button, it does clear that text box. Because in the constructor for the class associated with this page, we added code which set up an event handler for the click event of this button and made it so that when I click the button, we clear the text box.